Stupor mundi. It's Latin for wonder of the world. But in the 13th century, the phrase wasn't used to describe a historic place like the pyramids or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was a nickname for the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who ruled from 1220 to 1250. One of Frederick II's most notable accomplishments occurred in 1229 during the Sixth Crusade. Whereas the previous crusades failed to capture Jerusalem, Frederick II successfully regained control of the Holy Land for the Christians, including Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. And he did it without an ounce of violence. Sounds like quite the accomplishment, doesn't it? Here there were all of these violent campaigns to take back Jerusalem, and they only resulted in thousands and thousands of Christian casualties, and somehow Frederick II was able to not only regain the Holy Land, but to do so without shedding blood. One might give him a hero's parade, but that wasn't exactly the case in the church. In fact, he was excommunicated, not just once, but on a number of separate occasions. In fact, the Catholic Church disliked him so much they called an ecumenical council to have him deposed. It was the 13th ecumenical council in church history, the First Council of Lyon. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me as we continue another episode in our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. It has been fascinating learning about this aspect of church history, and I hope you found it enlightening as well. I am so appreciative of those of you who continue to leave positive reviews and encouraging comments for me on podcast platforms, YouTube, and on social media. I'd also love if you would consider becoming a patron and supporting this podcast with a monthly, annual, or a one-time gift. It's simple to do so. Just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. We are now more than halfway through this series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. If you've been following along from the beginning, you'll recall that the Catholic Church has held thousands and thousands of councils, but these general or ecumenical councils are like the landmark councils and are held in higher regard than any local council or synod. Once the church decides that these councils rise to a level of a general council or an ecumenical council, these are considered a dogmatic expression of the Catholic Church with respect to any theological decisions it makes. And as we've seen, particularly in the first 7 councils, the whole purpose of the council was to settle some sort of theological dispute. But then starting with the 8th council, the councils met to settle some sort of power struggle within the church. That's the case with the 13th Council as well, and this one was entirely convened to figure out what to do with Emperor Frederick II. If the name Frederick rings a bell, it's because we talked about Emperor Frederick I in episode 162. He's the one who crowned a bunch of fake popes in opposition to the real Pope Alexander III. His grandson, Frederick II, in addition to inheriting the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, also seems to have inherited his grandfather's disrespect of the papacy. And so to understand the First Council of Lyon, we really have to understand the life of Frederick II. Frederick II's upbringing blended together Norman, German, and Arabic influences. He was a scholar speaking 6 languages, including Arabic. He had a love for the poetic as well as the scientific, and it was that passion for academics that led him to found a number of universities and assemble a respectable court of scholars. He was the definition of a Renaissance man, and he is considered the greatest German emperor of all time, if not the greatest ruler of the medieval ages. I think it's tempting to see these historic conflicts as black and white, good and evil, especially when you have a conflict between the Pope and a secular ruler. But it was a lot more complicated than that, especially when you have a well-respected leader like Frederick II. And even with political epitaphs like Wonder of the World, it doesn't mean that everyone respected him or thought he was so wonderful. There's a lot we could talk about with respect to Emperor Frederick II, but I want to focus on the conflict with the popes that ultimately led to the First Council of Lyon. I want to begin shortly after his coronation as King of the Romans because it's here that he promised to join the Fifth Crusade. This is the crusade we talked about in the last episode, the one that was planned during the Fourth Lateran Council. However, Frederick never did join the forces, and when the Crusaders failed in their mission, Pope Honorius III and most people blamed Frederick II for the defeat. In 1225, Frederick promised Pope Honorius that he would embark on a crusade in 1228. That same year, he married the heiress to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1227, it seemed that Frederick was going to finally embark on the crusade, but instead he claimed to fall ill and never did actually set sail for Jerusalem. Whether he was sick or faking it is a matter of speculation, but ultimately, Gregory IX, who was pope at the time, excommunicated the emperor for his failure to make good on his promise to participate in the crusade. The next year, Frederick did embark on the crusade, but technically he was still excommunicated, so this was seen as an act of defiance, and the other crusaders were reluctant to help him. Instead of fighting, Frederick brokered the Treaty of Jaffa, in which the Muslims handed over the cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem and a corridor of territory connecting it to the rest of the kingdom. They also recognized the Christian possession of Nazareth and Sidon. Muslim holy places in Jerusalem, like the Dome of the Rock, were left under Muslim control, but Christians were to have access. Frederick II, along with all his other European titles, was also coronated as King of Jerusalem, even though technically it was his son that was supposed to inherit the throne. You might think that this was a real win for the Christians. Certainly, the Muslim world thought the Treaty of Jaffa was a disgrace. However, it didn't fare much better in Christendom. While those supporters of Frederick saw the treaty as a major act of diplomacy and a huge win, others considered it too far great a compromise. I suppose some were fixated on dominating through the killing of the infidels. While Emperor Frederick II was in the Holy Land, Pope Gregory IX sent a papal army to invade Sicily, and Frederick returned to Sicily, routed the army, and made a truce with the Pope. However, Frederick continued to conquer the lands all around the Papal States, and this caused some real concern for the Pope and those living in the Papal States. In 1239, Pope Gregory once again excommunicated Frederick, this time on grounds of heresy. Those who opposed him even referred to him as the Antichrist. To be fair, Frederick did entertain some heretical views. To solidify this excommunication, Pope Gregory called for a council. However, Frederick responded by attacking and sinking many of the ships carrying prelates to attend the council. Pope Gregory IX died in 1241, and Emperor Frederick captured a couple of cardinals on their way to the conclave. The conclave met and elected Pope Celestine IV, who only lived for 15 days. The next conclave was rather contentious as the cardinals divided into factions over what to do about Emperor Frederick II. After over a year, they finally elected Cardinal Sinibaldo de Fieschi, who took on the name of Pope Innocent IV. He was friendly with the emperor, and in fact, Emperor Frederick wrote a nice congratulatory note on his papal election. However, things didn't stay that way for long. Tensions between the empire and the papacy escalated, and citizens began taking sides, many siding with the emperor. Imperial agents began plotting an assassination of the pope, and Pope Innocent IV fled Italy in disguise for France, where he was warmly welcomed. He made his way to the city of Lyon, and knowing that a council would be impossible to convene in Rome, he instead summoned bishops to Lyon. In Lyon, bishops were less likely to encounter Frederick's forces, and should Frederick try and interfere with the council, they would be met with the Pope's ally, King Louis IX, aka Saint Louis. Yes, the same St. Louis for which the Missouri city is named after. Side note, oftentimes you'll see this as the First Council of Lyons, Lyons, but I'm using the French pronunciation of Lyon here. When the First Council of Lyon opened on June 28, 1245, there were only about 150 people in attendance, making it one of, if not the smallest ecumenical or general council in church history. However, there were 3 patriarchs actually in attendance. Pope Innocent IV opened the council with a sermon on the 5 wounds of Christ, and he compared each wound to a modern-day problem plaguing the church. For one, the poor behavior of both clergy and laity. Secondly, the Muslims in the Holy Land. Third, the Great East-West Schism. Fourth, the Tatars in Hungary. And lastly, the persecution of the church by the Emperor Frederick II. Emperor Frederick II was represented by his ambassador, Taddeo de Sousa, who argued first that the council didn't rise to the standard of a general or ecumenical council, and when that argument failed, he argued that the trial wasn't fair, that the Pope was both the plaintiff and judge. Pope Innocent IV agreed to give the emperor 10 days to appear in person and defend his case, and when Emperor Frederick failed to show up, the council continued. All in all, there were 3 sessions, and the council concluded about 3 weeks after it started, on July 17, 1245. The most notable decision of the council was a decree deposing Emperor Frederick II. The decree convicted him of 4 crimes: failing to keep his oath, deliberately breaking the peace between the church and the empire, committing sacrilege by arresting cardinals, clergy, and prelates who were summoned to the council, which Pope Gregory IX attempted to convene, and lastly, this edict convicted him of heresy. The document goes on to say that he is excommunicated and his subjects are not required to obey him, and that anyone who offers him help or advice will also be excommunicated. Like other councils, this First Council of Lyon also issued 27 canons. Let me give a brief summary of them. Canons 1 through 17 are all reforms on legal processes like trials and elections. For example, Canon 11 declares that plaintiffs who don't show up on time to a trial have to pay the expenses incurred by the defendant. Canon 18 prohibits people from hiring assassins to kill Christians. Canon 19 through 22 deal with excommunications and some of the nuances on how they are pronounced. Canon 19 reminds us, by the way, that the purpose of an excommunication is healing and not death. Canon 23 is a rather lengthy one and deals with management of church debt and what clergy should do in the event that they find themselves appointed over a church that has debt. It includes provisions for audits to ensure that clergy are acting responsibly with the goods entrusted to them. Canon 24 sets forth a plan to help rescue and save the Empire of Constantinople. Mainly the focus on this canon is how it will collect taxes to support Constantinople. Canon 25 encourages clergy to raise money for the Crusades. This includes offering indulgences for those that leave money in their wills for the funding of support for the Holy Land. What's interesting about this canon is that it associates indulgences with the donation of money. You may be familiar with the Protestant claim that Catholics were selling indulgences. There's a lot of nuance to that. And to understand what was going on, we really need to first understand what an indulgence is and isn't. And if you want to hear more about that topic, check out episode 56 called Indulgences, the Most Misunderstood Catholic Doctrine. We'll definitely talk more about the commercialization of indulgences when we get to the topic of the Protestant Reformation and the Council of Trent. Canon 26 focuses on the Tatars. I mentioned them earlier when talking about Pope Innocent IV's opening sermon, where he compared the Tatars to one of the wounds of Christ. The Tatars were a nomadic tribe of Mongol descent. They were brutal and slaughtered men, women, and children. This canon urges cities to fortify themselves and keep the Tatars at bay. Keep in mind that this is only 20 years after the great Genghis Khan led the Mongols. Similar to the last council, the final canon is lengthy and focuses on another crusade. This would be the 7th Crusade. It urges participation, both manpower and money, to support the cause of freeing the Holy Land from Muslim control and influence. The aftermath of the First Council of Lyon was a mixed bag. On one hand, the council achieved its aim at weakening the grip of Emperor Frederick II. However, it often came in the form of violent civil wars, which just created instability in the Holy Roman Empire. Following Frederick II's death, 5 years after the council, the empire splintered. In addition, bishops grumbled about the Pope's heavy taxes to support the Crusades. Let me conclude with a brief reflection. Throughout this series, we have seen the struggle between church and state. I mentioned in a previous episode how the Catholic Church is often redefining its place in temporal society based on the evolution of secular power. Here we see a further example of that. The Pope felt that it was the emperor's duty to participate in a crusade, and when he didn't participate, the Pope excommunicated him. I think it's fair to say that the church at this time in history expected the secular kingdoms to keep their hands off of the affairs of the church. However, the church also felt that secular rulers, since they were baptized Christians, had an obligation to participate in the needs of the church to some degree or another. And here we see an example of leaders pushing the envelope. Emperor Frederick II challenging the Pope by not complying to his wishes and seeming to push all of his buttons. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated the emperor when he failed to comply with his promises, and Pope Innocent IV went so far as to essentially cancel the emperor and lead a coup. If you think that it's difficult to imagine the Catholic Church interfering in politics at this level, you wouldn't be alone. But it's important to remember that this was a very different time, a very different world, a very different religious landscape. All of that would change, and once again the Catholic Church would evolve to better understand its place in society. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.